Hello, and welcome to Workplace Stories, the podcast where human capital experts share their real-world experiences and insights. Hosted by Red Thread Research, Workplace Stories surfaces the latest industry trends, innovative talent strategies, and best practices for success. Tune in for practical advice on how to best transform your workplace.
Welcome to Workplace Stories. We just finished our conversation with Jeremy Broome, who's the SVP Global Head of Talent at Visa. Danny, this was an incredible conversation about AI. What really jumped out at you?
So, Stacia, as you mentioned, it was a really rich conversation and it was super enjoyable. He's just a really fun person to talk to. One of the things that I liked most about this conversation is how optimistic it was. Obviously, there's a lot going on with AI right now, and everybody's wondering about what it's going to do to jobs and how it's going to affect costs and all this kind of stuff. But he was just incredibly optimistic about its power in the future and its power to work with humans to make things better in the future. One of the other things is he flat out said that people are going to become more important, not less important. We were talking about context and how the lower level jobs, if they're replaced by AI, don't give people the context they need to learn on the job to do some of those higher level jobs. But he talked about this idea of community and people getting that context from the conversations rather than the work itself. And it not just being somebody in their corner office talking to AI all day, but using it as a tool in the context of this larger community, which I thought was really great. One other thing that he mentioned is this idea of risk. It is risky to implement some of these AI things. And he used the analogy of one-way door versus a two-way door. Is it a one-way door, meaning we have to throw our cap over the wall and we can't go back? Or are there things that we can do that are two-way doors? We can go in, we can try some things, we can back out if it doesn't work, which I thought was a really interesting and sane way to think about AI and all the flurry that's going on with it. How about you? What stood out to you?
Well, building on that point, when he was talking about one-way doors versus two-way doors, I asked him, when do you decide a one-way door is okay? And it was basically, at least as I understood it, when the impact is so positive on their stakeholders that it makes sense to do. So he gave the example of being able to help their customers get answers to their questions faster, or their team, folks on their team, be able to do their jobs better and more efficiently. And that may seem a little bit generic, but he gave some really specific examples that made it feel very real. So I like that a lot. Relatedly, he also talked about how they were using AI in their sales feedback training, which we hear a lot of AI in terms of creating content, but not in terms of feedback. And he said that by using the AI, they could, one, get greater scale, but two, it was less threatening. And we hear a lot about AI being threatening, but this is an example where AI is not threatening because it could just give feedback. And it's, I think you said, there's no judgy bot. So I thought that was a really nice point of how they're using AI to make people better in a way that makes them more comfortable with learning. And then the third thing that jumped out at me was he talked about how they have this long history with AI, and that has given them an opportunity to often ask really tough questions around what they're doing with technology, why they're doing it, what the risks are, all those things. And that has built a muscle within Visa that has translated over well into this GenAI era. So they're still having those questions, still pushing around things, having disagreements. But then at some point you, as you said, you can disagree, but you commit and you move forward. And that muscle, I think, is something that a lot of organizations are building today. And it was really cool to hear him talk about how they already have it. So we are sure that you all listening will gain a huge amount. Literally, we probably got through maybe half of our questions. So you'll see that there's lots more that we would have loved to ask him, but you'll get a ton from what we did ask him. This is a fantastic conversation. If you want to give us any feedback on it, we would love to hear it on the Red Thread platform or in any of the places you get your podcast or on LinkedIn.
And if you like what we put out today, feel free to join us. We'd love to have you as part of the Red Thread community. You can learn more about it at www.redthreadresearch.com. or shoot us a note on LinkedIn and we'll give you some personal information. Thanks so much.
Welcome to Workplace Stories, Jeremy. We are so excited to have you with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great. Been looking forward to this as a while, and you've set high expectations, so no pressure to come up with pearls of wisdom. We'll see what we can get to through the course.
Absolutely. Before we get into the pearls, can you start off by sharing a bit about your background?
Sure. Yeah. So originally from the UK, I started in executive search career-wise for about 8-9 years, ran my own firm with a colleague for a big part of that, and then moved out to Asia Pacific to Singapore to go and set up the organization out there. And that's where I then moved into HR in-house. It was, I would say, around 2008, 2009. It was good timing. Moved into an investment bank just as the financial crisis was kicking off. But being out in Asia Pacific with what was going on with the capital markets out there, it was a good place, frankly, to see out the financial crisis. There's a lot of capital flowing into Asia. There's obviously the IPO market in China was going crazy. So it was a really good place to spend. I think I spent total 8 years across 2 stints in Singapore with Deutsche Bank on the investment banking side, and a couple of years in the middle there in Germany. So having never spoken German, I got asked to come to Germany and take on the role as the Personalleiter for our German business, which I think what I heard from the Works Council day one, that they were only going to speak to me in German. It was going to be a challenging couple of years, but it was a lot of fun. And then joined Visa 6 years ago, moved to Dubai just a year before, obviously, the pandemic hit. I spent the first year getting to know Central and Eastern Europe, Middle East and Africa for Visa. That was my sort of introduction to fintech. Again, and by this point, I was long out of recruitment and into business partnering and HR management in general. Spent 3 years there during a couple of years of the pandemic, and then moved to the Bay Area with Visa 3 years ago. So been here in the Bay Area. Initially, I feel a bit like Al Pacino in The Godfather. You think you've escaped talent acquisition and they drag you back in. And then as a reward for that, then I get other stuff as well. So my role now, as you mentioned, is global talent. So talent acquisition, talent management, learning and development, org design, employee experience, employee listening, value proposition, all of that sort of stuff. It's an interesting role. I think a lot of these roles have been created at various organizations over the last few years, which have strategically tried to look at what are capabilities organizations are trying to build, buy, borrow, develop, organize, all of that sort of stuff. And that's what I do at Visa. That's the potted history.
That's cool.
It also feels like a lot, especially right now. That's a lot of responsibility. All the things for all the talent at Visa. Today, we're going to talk to you a little bit about AI. In fact, we're going to talk to you a lot about AI. So as we jump into this, we're going to ask you a question we ask everyone, which is, why should we listen to you on the topic of AI?
I mean, it's a good question. Visa, as an organization, we've had AI as part of our business for 30 years or more. If you think about the business that we're in, the payments transactions business, we're in protecting and securing payments across the world. And Visa's been at the forefront of using AI to manage and protect risk and payments over that period of time. We've really been I think on the technology side, at the forefront of AI. And I think that flows through to just our culture as an organization. And when we think about people and we think about how we're leveraging AI, not just obviously in terms of things like agentic commerce and what we're doing in our industry and our payment space, but then how do we think about our business and our organization? So I think Visa's in a really good position. We have phenomenal teams thinking about AI and have done for many years. So that's sort of one aspect of it. I also think we do a lot of thinking about this, right? We don't have all the answers. And I think we haven't been sort of like, oh, let's jump on this bandwagon or that bandwagon. We're trying to really think what makes sense. Asking a lot of questions around where's it going? How do we utilize AI? Not necessarily having all the answers, but I actually think in many ways, the answers are changing so quickly. You know, the 18 months and 2 years of ChatGPT, like the answers you would have given 6 months ago, 12 months ago, like they're the wrong answers today. So I think it's almost more important that we're just continually asking the questions and challenging ourselves on it. And so there you go. That's why I think maybe listen to us, listen to me, maybe. We'll see where we get to the end of this, whether it's worthwhile or not.
One of the reasons we wanted to speak with you, yes, was because of that foundation in AI that goes back so far at Visa, but also with regard specifically to generative AI, you all have been on the earlier side of adoption and experimentation. So can you talk to us a little bit about why that's the case? Yes, there's the history, but GenAI itself is a bit different than machine learning, or at least traditional machine learning. So can you talk why you initially approached GenAI?
Yeah, I think as an organization, again, I think just given our sort of history and our culture, we very much saw generative AI as soon as it's launched as an opportunity. I think there was always a sort of mindset of what does it mean for us? What does it mean for people's jobs? What's it going to disintermediate or whatever else, right? I think our sort of mental positioning was like, great, this is another technology. It's a very different technology and a transformative technology in a way that other technologies have not been, but we saw it as an opportunity. And I think that's how we always position, right? I think we, as a business, we love the opportunity that technological advancement offers to our customers, to our stakeholders, to the environment which we work. So I think there's a sort of a pre-positioning of seeing these things as opportunities around generative AI. I think the second one was, again, tied to our business, right? If I think about what we try and facilitate, we're trying to facilitate payment experiences around the globe. We're trying to work with our partners and seeing the opportunity that generative AI had around commerce to be able to support consumers around thinking differently about commerce, access to being involved in industry as it develops, the buyers and sellers. We're in a connecting business. And I think we could immediately see like really interesting value propositions for our customers around it. So I think that's why from the get-go. And I also think just honestly, sort of leadership from the top, whether it's our board, whether it's our management team, whether it's our CTO, we very quickly, I think, rallied around, let's organize the organization, let's get the whole organization behind this, recognizing that I think the opportunities were both grassroots level. This is a tool that's being put in the hands of individuals in a way that many other transformative tools and technologies actually have to be implemented top down. But at the same time, we recognize that we had to, as an organization, rally around supporting that, whether it's in terms of tools and platforms and partnerships, or in terms of policies and guidelines and support and legitimacy and all of this sort of stuff. So yeah, I think we very quickly recognized that, and we're like, now we have to help the organization unlock that, right? And see the opportunity of it.
Talk to us a little bit about maybe some specifics on what you're doing with respect to generative AI. So when you think about the people practices, what kinds of things are you doing or implementing?
Yeah, so I think there's been the very sort of like quick ones that we've, again, put the tools in the hands of all of our employees. So I think taking the sort of grassroots approach, which is like, we're here to help you utilize the tools. We're not going to tell you this is how you should use the tools. But by putting standards in place and giving access to people to our own instance of ChatGPT, quickly sort of building our own sort of models around it and so on. I think if I think about sort of recruiters, I think some of the recruiters were some of the quickest people to go, hold on a sec, I do research into, I don't know, I'm in an executive search side of our business, and I usually spend a whole bunch of time trying to research which companies I should be looking at when I'm mapping the market. They were like some of the first people were like, just give me the tools and I can cut what was a 4-hour piece of work into 20 minutes, right? At least getting a starting point. Or again, recruiters who are very much, how can I use this to think differently about how I position the opportunity, or like job descriptions, right? So I think a lot of people were very much, we want the tools. And our job in that was to say, great, here are secure instances. Here are some of the things you should do and shouldn't do, and let's create sort of opportunities for people to use it. So I think that's sort of one side, is just go put the basic tools in people's hands in a safe and secure and responsible way. I think the second one was then, it has been great, like the learning space has been a great example, right? I think there have been lots of tools that initially came up where it was great, okay, how can we generate learning content? How can we generate training content, avatars, all this sort of stuff? And again, rather than us being like, okay, what's the top-down AI strategy? It was very much like, okay, people seeing what tools are out there and what could they use and how could they experiment with those tools. So again, using some of the generative AI to build training content has been a good example. Clearly, I think from a people organization as well, we then got into the piece, which is like, okay, we have chatbots, right? How can we build on those? How can we improve those? How can we feed them with the right information? How can we start to expand, which was very much that sort of Q&A type chatbot. Like, here's the option of 6 things and then directing you to content, to like, how do we evolve that into something which is much more sort of a natural language sort of conversation and generating sort of content for our employees in response. So I think it's been, I'd say, both the sort of the unstructured, like give you the tools, it's been tap into the technologies that are there. And then it's been like, okay, where do we see best use in some of actually expanding out the API, but API to API based like chatbot stuff and feeding it with the right information that, and again, in a secure, responsible way.
Okay. And this is interesting because Stacia and I have seen this pattern in other organizations as well. Let's put it in the hands of people, let them experiment with the thing, figure out what works and what doesn't work, and learn from each other. And then the last thing that you just said was connect API to API and maybe think more broadly about this. So that would be my next question. How did your earlier experiments maybe inform your approach to scaling?
Yeah, I think the real challenge around that is like, where is it easy to scale versus where do we want it to scale? And I think that's sort of where do the tools exist and where do we want to go? So we've obviously started like thinking a lot about like agentic workers and this sort of stuff. And sometimes you're like, it's okay, we see where there are like a lot of rules based and a lot of information documentation. And then how can we start to build or plug gaps in our employee experience or our customer experience or whatever else it is, like in where there's a natural sort of gap. We see like we're doing experiments obviously within sort of finance, within procurement, obviously, I think obviously in the recruiting space and so on and so forth. But then there's the sort of question of actually, okay, like where are we actually going to solve this through like third-party technologies who are just going to be continued to improve? And like, where's really critical experience gaps for us? I don't know, interviewing or whatever else. And we're like, okay, here's the gap where we actually really see an opportunity to bring the real benefits of generative AI, which really scale. So I give you an example, right, is there are roles where you're automating process. And okay, how do you use generative AI when you're building on that sort of process automation type sort of view of the world? Then there are the pieces where, hold on a second, if we've got agents who are saying, okay, rather than coming up with one hypothesis or two hypotheses and working out, okay, what are the implications and what should we be doing? If agents can now say, hey, look, we can actually test 50 or 100 different scenarios and we can play that out over time and we can see what the different sort of options are. That's where we want to use the power of it rather than the sort of the easy sort of plug a hole. So it's starting to think about like more intentionally, where do we want to put our efforts rather than where is it easy to go? Because that not necessarily is like where the highest order benefit is going to be derived from it.
Yeah, that's interesting. So how are you making, this might sound like an obvious question, but it's not in my head. How are you making those distinctions between like where it's easy to go versus where it's actually going to have an impact? How do you choose where it's going to have an impact?
And it's actually, I mean, it's interesting, like I had a conversation with our sort of chief product and head of strategy the other day, just saying like, we've got to start thinking about like our workforce strategy as a whole and thinking about, okay, where's the best use of like human capital, generally human capabilities within that versus where are there like the workforce is actually better served by this type of sort of power in computing and depth and breadth and so on that agentic sort of workforce could give us. So it's actually saying, again, rather than saying, okay, like where are we today and then how do we build out from it? It's like, and again, this is really early days, but we started with the conversation, which is like, what could our organization look like in 5 years' time and how could that be radically different? Coming out like vastly different scenarios. Some of them are just like crazy loopy sort of scenarios, but like by actually playing some of that out and just thinking, okay, if you were to build this, like, I know in 5 years' time, a 70 billion revenue organization, but like rather than with the same number of people or twice the number of people, like what could you do with like 5,000 people? Is that even possible? If you were to do something like that, where would you best put your human capital and the humanity side of thinking and relationships and ideation versus what could you do better through that? So it's actually taking that big step back and thinking like more broadly, what do we different sides of the equation give you that are like a vastly different, really?
I want to build on this a little bit because we've been talking to some folks about how do you think about impact versus risk. I know that what you just described is looking at future scenarios and which ones may be ones you need to be prepared for. But a lot of the folks we're talking to are also thinking heavily about what are the risks involved and having a trade-off with the potential impact. How are you thinking about that risk component?
Yeah, it's a really, really important one. And I think there's the sort of the hard risk side of things. So like regulatory risk and everything that sort of comes on that side and things that relate to explainability and future-proofing access, all of that sort of, I would say, hard side of risk. There's also the bit which is, I would say, the risk as it relates to, I think it's how we think about ourselves as human beings within the organization and the value that we derive. Experimentation is great, but it also creates sort of a certain amount of uncertainty. So how do people think about like their role within the organization, their purpose within the organization? And that's not a regulatory, that's not a hard risk, but it's a really material risk because you've got a bunch of people who are saying, as we know, the basic scenario is my job here. Like, should I be getting ahead of that by looking at something else? And so thinking about the human side of the risk, the soft risk element of it, I think is really important. There's also the bit, and it's really interesting, I think we started talking more a bit about one-way and two-way doors. Like people's heard about this, but like our CEO, Ryan, was talking about it recently. And it's like, how do we look at problems and we go, is this a door that we can walk back through? If we make this decision and we go through the door, can we go, yeah, don't like it, let's walk back through the door. So it's a two-way door as opposed to the one-way doors that you walk through, it closes behind you and like, damn it, I can't get back through that door anymore. And I think very intentionally thinking about like the one-way, two-way door thing is quite helpful for us to say, are these risks that are worth taking? Or if we take these risks, how do we really think about it? What's the mental effort that we really put into the conviction that we put behind it? And not mistaking sometimes, like as organizations, not mistaking two-way doors as one-way doors or one-way doors as two-way doors and just saying, so yeah, what type of problem is it that we're facing? And I think that's been a good way of us thinking about the measured risk that we want to take.
Just to make that a little bit more concrete, what are the types of impacts or levels of impact that would be great enough to burn the boats? One-way door.
We think about our customers first and foremost. So like, what is the materiality of the impact on our customers? We think about our stakeholders, the governments around the world, the regulators around the world. We think about, obviously, revenue. Is this something which, again, is going to have such a material impact that we can't back out of it, right? So I think some of those sort of pieces around people, regulators, financials, all of this sort of stuff, I think, and particularly it's interesting within, I think, the sort of the AI space, right, is you can make decisions and you can implement those decisions in terms of your operations, right? I think about within talent operations. People experimenting with tools is one thing. Us rebuilding our workflows, which generally is like longer term projects and is built on our tech stack. And then that's a huge amount of effort that people put in. And it's, as we all know within the HR community, once you implement something, you're like stuck with it for a few years, no matter, because you can't just go, oh, do you know what? Let's rebuild that, like that tech stack or implement a new HCM or any of those sort of crazy things. So it's some of those sort of pieces, which, yeah, whether in the people community or whether in the sort of the business community, we certainly think about.
Okay. Thank you. That's helpful. In our prep call, you and I talked a bit about structured thinking. And you said you thought that one of Visa's strengths was that you have structured thinking about the entire AI space. So can you elaborate on what that structured thinking is and how that shapes your overall AI strategy?
I'm trying to remember the conversation where I said that. I mean, I do think we're a very thoughtful organization. We think about, again, as an organization which has such a responsibility across the area in which we play. We're not ignorant of that fact. I think we don't take decisions lightly. And I think on any of these things, and I think generative AI and AI generally is one of those, we really do try and bring the whole organization to bear. So I think when this conversation around generative AI started, the immediate thing was like, how do we get everybody from technology, but from people, from legal and risk and compliance and sourcing? Like, how do we get everybody's views? How do we get the business views around the table? And so it was very much like, how do we bring all of those perspectives in to thinking about the utilization and the risks and the opportunities and so on? And I think that's where, like, when I think about structured, these are sort of like big tools and big opportunities and do come with risks. So trying to get the maximum amount of voices in the room so that then we can say, okay, great. So this is our plan of action. We love talking about the accountability to drive things forward, but making sure that we've had the debates. Like, we've really had the good debates and the structured debates before we make those decisions go forward. And you've always got to balance that with speed and innovation and creativity and everything else like that. But it's one where making sure that we've had the debates and the disagree and commit type of debates and all of that before we actually move forward, I think is quite important.
Well, and I'd imagine the fact that you have such a long history. This isn't the first time you've had debates about AI and then disagree and commit. And so it sounds like you have a muscle and a culture around having those conversations that you could then easily adapt for this specific Gen AI moment.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, like any organization, over many years, we've been on a cultural journey and culture continues to evolve. As a piece of the history, Visa used to be an association until we did our IPO. In that sense, we were there at the service of the banks that owned Visa. And you're always trying to find, and for a company that has been so innovative and so creative around this sort of technology space, one which I think we've always looked at, like, how do we serve the multiple constituents who use the network? Whether I think about consumers who use our cards, I think about merchants who are accepting credentials, I thinking about the financial institutions that are issuers and acquirers, and I think about us as the glue that binds together. We've got a long history of, like, how do we make this work for everybody? How do you balance the interest? In Germany, you use the Interessensausgleich, right? There's balance of interests between all the different constituents because you want to make it work for everybody. And sometimes that, is like, does that lead to consensus or lowest common denominator or what works for everybody? And I think we've had a muscle from Dee Hock, who was really founding father of Visa and this sort of business, to somehow find creativity and innovation and pushing the boundaries whilst making it work for all constituents. And obviously those constituents are ever expanding as the payment space has expanded and different players have come in. So I do think it is a muscle, but it is one where trying to balance those things and make sure we've got really good maintaining sort of leading thinking around this, but making sure that we're really mindful of it working for all the constituents.
So I want to talk maybe about one of your constituents, and that's your employees, your current employees and your future employees. Talk a little bit about how this work with AI has changed and maybe will continue to change the way that you think about what those employees do and what they need.
It's a really interesting one. I think it's amazing how quickly as well people adapt. I think the sort of the cycle of, when we first saw ChatGPT 4.0 come out, and then the time frame why people got to know how to use it, and like there was a very quick adoption of the technology. And I think in many ways employees drove that themselves, right? Like we helped and we provided, I think, framing and all this sort of stuff around them, responsible AI and all this sort of stuff. But I think for employees, the change management piece has been, I can't think of the right word, but it's been everywhere. It's every aspect of AI. It has come into every aspect of life, from the moment you swipe and open your phone through to buying experience or through to your work. It's everywhere. So I think for employees and AI, we've been very mindful of like, how can we actually create an environment where employees can share and approach it that perspective rather than us like teaching them stuff. And I think so in many ways, I see this journey we've been on with AI as employee driven. And I give you an example, right? Visa University, which is our learning organization, which is a phenomenal sort of corporate university. When we looked at like, how do we tackle AI? Yes, there was the usage and the tool usage and that sort of training. But very quickly, we've pivoted to like, how do we just facilitate exchange of knowledge between employees? Because employees are actually learning about this faster than we can teach them. And it's actually really changing the way that we think about learning as a whole. And we know it's not just the tools and stuff that people use to learn, but it's like how learning is changing. And it's becoming learning from each other, learning sort of use cases, exchange of knowledge, rather than the sort of didactic one way we'll tell you how to do it and then you go and do it. So I think employees have been at the center of all of this change. And so I think us looking to employees in a different way to say, you teach us as an organization rather than we'll teach you as an organization, I think is a sort of a very healthy shift in many ways. And it's putting sort of like a more expanded sort of view of an employee's role in terms of the impact they can have on an organization. And also, I think it's quite an exciting one where it opens up the creativity that employees can have and the contributions they can make. So, yeah.
You don't have to answer this in the context of Visa, but I'm super curious about maybe the way that you're thinking about this. I just got out of our advisory board meeting for L&D, and we were thinking in terms of what is the system now that exists between what AI can do and what employees can do. You know what I mean? So it's not just like a few years ago, we saw some research that was like, yeah, by 2026, 30% of a job is going to be done by AI. Isn't that great? We're going to have all this free time and we're going to spend it on the beach. And we all know that that's not true. We're going to find efficiencies by combining jobs and all of these types of things. So I'm wondering, in the way that you're thinking about workforce planning, or philosophically even, the way that you think about workforce planning, what does that system look like? What does the sort of like the robots and the humans working together look like? And not just what does it look like at a point in time, but how do you adapt to continuously take advantage of the things that AI can do and at the same time leverage the people in better ways?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one because I think roles obviously continually evolving. And I think we think about them, to your point, is like what percentage of this thing today is going to be different tomorrow. There's part of me which thinks is like, actually, are we on different tracks here? I use the sort of, I don't know, I remember saying this, like I talk about this at one point, which was the whalers and electricians example, the 1900s. Is like, there were loads of whalers because we needed like whale fat to go and make lamps. And it wasn't like suddenly the whalers learned how to use electricity. It was like, hold on, you needed less whalers and suddenly more electricians. And so it was sort of, you almost like you jumped the railroad tracks in terms of capability. But it wasn't as if anyone was out there going, oh, like you see this evolution and it's almost on parallel paths and people jump across in many ways. And I think some of it, when I think about the systems around workforce planning, how do we think about that? It is the sort of the end back thinking rather than the sort of the where are we today and how do we think out? Because you do get stuck into the incrementalism of the change. And you almost become dependent, right? Which is like, okay, if the job is 100 units today and like next year, like 20 of those units are done by something else, and what do we do with those 20 units? It becomes very incremental in terms of how you're envisaging workforce. So the sort of stuff we're doing is, and we've done this, look, we are really not the best on strategic workforce planning. Like I could confess that now. But some of the sort of the things that we've tried, and I've tried this in the past, is doing more like things like scenario-based workforce planning. And a lot of this stuff comes from sort of military, right? And all of that sort of stuff, military workforce planning as well. If this happens or that happens, and you start to do scenario-based sort of workforce planning. And I think those are sort of sometimes helpful lens for us to think about, okay, if the technologies do this, versus this, like what does that mean for workforce? What are the debates that you see going on? Is it the junior roles that are going to go, or is it like the managers that are going to go, right? Or what part of it, or is it senior managers going to go and democratization of work, blah, blah, blah. Rather than saying, okay, like you're sort of incrementally working forward, is okay, what's the scenario if that does happen? Or what's the scenario if that does happen? Then you sort of work out what your plans are to make sure that you're ready for any of those outcomes. So I think starting to think more because of, I think, how disruptive the technologies could be, but we just don't know. Right. I think this is what we've learned over the last sort of 18 months, 2 years with generative AI is you just don't know which way it's going to go in the utilization of it. So I think for any sort of organization thinking about skills and capabilities on the learning side of things, I think one of them is not to try and, again, I go back to sort of how learning is changing, not to try and predict what it's going to be and then tell people. And again, I think unfortunately by saying to people, this is what's going to happen, you're making an implicit promise, which is if you just do what we say, then you're all good. And that isn't actually the case. It's actually how can we create an environment, the access to what you want to be doing and how you're seeing things going. And again, the sort of sharing information. The upskilling, reskilling conversation is a case of we suddenly discover that the technologies can do this. What does that mean for that? And then how do we pivot as quickly as possible to reskill and upskill people across sort of functions and so on and so forth? And you get into that sort of discussion. So I don't think an easy answer on it for sure. That's why you came away from a discussion on it and so on. But I think it's thinking about some of those type of things which can help you get ahead of whatever the changes might be.
One more just follow-up tangent to that. In that discussion with the advisory board, we were also talking about some of the AI is coming in and doing some of the entry-level jobs. Like those are just going away. And so when you talk about upskilling, we're talking about replacing the learning on the job that happened in those entry-level positions so that they can now do the higher level work. Have you thought about that at all in your organization? Are you addressing it at all?
Yeah, no, it's interesting because again, I'm just reflecting back on the conversation I had with our CPO. It goes back to, again, it's quite a linear way of thinking about it. It's okay, so you're going to come in at this level and you'd learn a bunch of stuff. And then you get to a sort of a level of proficiency where you could manage the stuff that you otherwise would have learned because you've learned it. It's quite a sort of, it's a linear sort of way. And I think one of the worries is like, okay, how do you get a lot of that knowledge accumulation in order to do this sort of higher level work? And actually, I think what is happening is the access to the knowledge, you don't have to build the knowledge because the knowledge is at your fingertips. Like the idea of being credentialed through a number of years of building knowledge, which is generally what you do through those sort of first years, is like, well, actually, I don't need to do that because the knowledge is at my fingertips. So what do I need to do? What is my role? And we've talked a lot about it's actually, we need our people who can ask the best questions. How do you really get the best questions being asked? Because the answers are there and it's not like, okay, you have to build that knowledge. So when we've been thinking about like, okay, what does it mean for early careers? What does it mean for like hiring a graduate from college or whatever else coming to the organization? Who do we want and how do we bring them in? How do we educate them? Actually, what you're saying is we need to find people who know how to ask really good questions, like really perceptive questions, who can be thinking about the environment in which they're working and asking questions. So we often bring people in and say, like, tell us the answers and learn the answers. And that's what we're saying now, don't worry, we'll get the answers somewhere else, but like, let's ask the questions. So I think those are some of the things that we're thinking about around early careers.
Yeah, I can totally see that. And it's a point of view that I hadn't really thought of, Jeremy. That's a point of view I hadn't thought of. I also think about the familiarity and the context with which you do work often depends on the experiences that you've had. So asking a question is one thing, but getting that context and sitting and marinating in it. I use the example a lot of cleaning my own data. I clean my own data, so I'm familiar with the database. So when I'm doing this stuff, it's easier and it's more whatever. And that might be a terrible example because AI can now clean my data and analyze my data. But there's something to be said about that context. I'm looking for the answer. I don't know what it is. Like, how do you get that context so that they can continue to do the higher level thinking? Because it involves so many things that I'm not sure you can get just by asking questions.
No, it's interesting. And I think this is where, like, this can be quite a strengthening thing in terms of like community. I'm trying to remember, I will find the name of the person. I was listening to a podcast with David Runciman, who's Oxford University. I think he's the head of political history at Oxford University. And he was talking to somebody who's doing a lot of sort of philosophical stuff in the AI space. And the interesting thing was like my conversations, and they are conversations with generative AI, they're sort of unidirectional. And it's dependent on me like thinking about, okay, how could I ask that differently? Okay, how can I do this? How could I do that? Right. And so on and so forth. On the other side of it is like the human side of things. Like when you actually have this discussion, you're like, I hadn't thought about that. And then you suddenly go off on a tangent and you're reacting to how other people approach. It's an inherent, like conversations. The conversations with ChatGPT are inherently inhuman. The conversations you have with people are inherently human. And I think they offer fundamentally different things, right? In terms of how we explore ideas, how open we are to ideas. And so I think this is where there is going to be a real role for generative AI, as you say, like processes, clean this, give me the answers to this, give me other answers, give me different answers. How should I think about this? But just the pure sort of nature of like human interaction, human conversation, that's actually where I think the sort of the magic is going to be going forward. It is in the exploration based on, to your point, the context and the experience that you've had through the many human interactions. One of the worries is that, like, do I just become like a hermit with ChatGPT because like I can get all my answers from there and it becomes quite a hermetic experience of like life? And actually, I think that there's this other part of it which is inherently human. And I think it's actually going to strengthen those aspects of human conversation. I think in the workplace, right, exchange of ideas in the workplace, and takes away some of the go clean my database and gets into the like, why would I want to clean my database? And what do you do with your database? No, I think there's actually a real sort of humanity strengthening and community strengthening aspect that's going to come of this as well.
I find that very optimistic. I love it.
One thing that jumped out at me from that is how ultimately it is a different beast. If you're assuming that it will be a replacement for human interaction, to your point, you'll get at this hermetic existence. But if you recognize that it is just a different invention, it's not a replacement for human interaction. It's not a replacement for maybe cleaning your own data, but it is something else that kind of does a slightly different thing. I think that accords, or at least it gives me almost a permission to be like, okay, well, it's just going to be different. I don't have to see it as diminishing something else. It's just its own thing.
Yeah. And again, yes, maybe I'm too optimistic on this, but I think somebody's got to be optimistic on it. But I think you're absolutely right, Stacia. It's saying this is additive. This is not a replacement for, and it's something which can really enrich and enhance. And again, one of the people who was me and we were chatting the other day, doing some sort of baseline research into something. And again, it would have been like 2 days of just churning through stuff. And instead, the basis for the conversation that we then had was like, great, can we meet in 2 hours and we'll have a chat about it? And then it's really opening up the opportunities rather than, I think, closing them in some ways.
I like it. For the record, I like your optimism. That's not a dig in any way. We don't hear it enough. I like the optimism.
So Jeremy, we're going to take a quick little break and lift it up a little bit and ask you a few lightning round questions. The first one is a new question. Nobody's ever answered this one, which is, if you could join a band, which one would it be?
I did think about this one. And actually, so I was back in college days, I was in a band and it was the Chris Rowley Trio, but there were 4 of us. So the Chris Rowley Trio existed. And then I joined the band as the singer and we became the 4-person trio, which was unique. So there you go. That's the band I would join. I love being part of the band and yeah, it was good. So there you go. Awesome. Chris Rowley Trio.
Sort of along those lines, song or poetry or something that you've completely memorized?
Yeah, I grew up in the British public school system and Shakespeare was obviously a big part of that. So if you want me to do Hamlet's soliloquy, I can do Hamlet's soliloquy. I remember learning it when I was about like 11 years old. And for whatever reason, it's still the thing that's in my head. I can do it beginning to end. That's
brilliant. I can do all of the intro to Aladdin.
Wow. Impressive stuff.
I think Hamlet's a little more impressive, honestly. Okay. What is your go-to karaoke song?
So it is Summer Nights, John Travolta. And every year we have, So we do annual market kickoff at Visa every year. We get together and my boss, our chief people and administrative officer, Kelly Toulier, is the chief karaoke person. So she gets us all up there. And myself and my colleague, Molly Paget, it's a duo every year with the first song up and it's Summer Nights. So there you go.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, that's amazing.
There are some problematic lines in it. So there's a little bit of like, but hey, it's John Travolta and Olivia Newton-John. As are most songs that were written like 40 years ago, there's something problematic with them these days.
Yeah. Some of them have not aged as well as others. So Jeremy, one of the things I was really excited to talk about in today's discussion is how you all are using AI-powered feedback in sales training. So we've heard a lot about using AI for content generation, et cetera, but not the same thing around AI-powered feedback. So can you walk us through what this is, the tools, techniques involved, and what you see as the impact on the salesperson's confidence in client interactions?
Yeah. And it's interesting you talk about confidence because that is our measure. Before we do sales training, it's what's your confidence in selling these products and services, and then we measure that sort of confidence in selling those afterwards. We've been lucky enough, we're using the technology HighSpot, which is part of our sort of overall sort of sales enablement technology stack, which we use for knowledge management and so on and so forth. But we've built into that, we've built the competency models and we've built like what great sellers look like in terms of how they have conversations. And then we've really used the coaching sort of capability within that. So, our sellers will go in and we'll say, great, okay, here's all of the content that you need to learn about the sort of products and services. Then we put them into the practice environment. It's okay, so go pitch to AI the products and services and solutions. And then it's been really good because when we're trying to do that sort of role-based training with real people, people are going into those sort of conversations already with like the role-playing mental barrier, which is the hard one. Whereas being able to sort of leverage generative AI to say, okay, great, based off what we've built into the models and so on, these are the aspects that you talked about, but you could have emphasized more on this side or on that side of it and so on. And that feedback is entirely sort of neutral and it comes back. So that's how we've built it into the sales training. And what we found is people are much more comfortable with that sort of role-based practice with the AI environment rather than with a human environment, particularly with their bosses and stuff like that we used to do, or expert sales trainers. There's still a role clearly for that. But what it's obviously done is provide us a scalable platform. So if I think about the sort of the few thousand sellers that we have across the organization, we've been able to get this into their hands, like ubiquitously across the board. Whereas if we were trying to get sales coaches to go and do that and the time and the space, and people could do it when they do it and when they want to do it, rather than just, okay, if you're an AP, you have to turn up at 5:00 on a Wednesday and whatever else, and we'll fly some sales trainers over and all of this sort of stuff. So it's been really helpful using that side of it for sales training. Yeah, it's been a big unlock, actually.
That's great. So you mentioned, yes, there's still a place for live sales trainers. And so how are you thinking about that AI-human collaboration?
Yeah, so we always think about, obviously, there's the knowledge imparting piece and the learning piece. Then there's the practice piece. Then there's the sort of actually go and do it in a real environment piece, go and use it in real life. It's really been that practice piece, which I think is so important. And it's actually really hard to like find the time and the space and so on. We've really been thinking about how do we blend this side of it with, and I go back to like how we're thinking about knowledge sharing, the community-based learning piece. So the human interaction of one seller talking to another seller or groups of sellers saying, okay, what was the value proposition for this product? Like, how did you package this together? What resonated with the client? Oh, okay, that's interesting. Yeah, and we bundled it together with this. And these are the sort of questions they were asking. And so there's a real sort of like human element in terms of like exchange of knowledge and learning from each other. When it comes to like the practice piece, that's the bit which is, okay, right now you can go to the role-based practice piece and that's where it is. So that's where I think we've seen this sort of shift in terms of learning, the community-based learning piece versus obviously, I think you still need this role within practice. And that's where we found, opportunities with generative AI.
That's interesting. It seems that would be less threatening. There's no human judgment associated with it. It's just, hey, you're doing this wrong. I can see how that could be more effective.
There's a lot of judgy people out there, and now you have one less judgy person to judge you.
You have a judgy bot instead.
Yeah, exactly.
But actually, to that point, do people fear that the bot is tracking and it's being used for performance assessments or anything like that?
No, I think because it's been explicitly within the context of learning. I think this is where it's in a learning environment where you're there to fail, right? You're there to fail until you get it right. And I think that's an inherent part of learning. And I think that's very different than when you're doing it with your boss, you're like, oh my God, like, do they think I'm crap at this? And so the actual sort of the risk of failure with a real person, particularly if it's somebody on your team, or it's like, how are they going to judge you? Like, is a real material piece. Like, people are drawing conclusions, whereas I can fail as many times as I want. It's like playing chess on the app, right? It's like, if I'm playing against the AI, who cares if I screw it up a million times? Because that's fine, as opposed to the pressure that comes with I'm actually playing somebody in real life and the pressure that comes with that. So I think it's easier to just acknowledge that the failure part is part of learning, really. Well,
speaking of learning, I want to talk about another way that you're using it. And not surprisingly, I'm doing a study right now on AI in learning and looking at the functionalities this is the number one way that we're seeing show up in technologies for the use of AI in learning. But you're using AI-driven learning pathways.
Yes. Yeah.
So talk a little bit about how you're tailoring those pathways specifically to the individual.
Honestly, on this one, it's more experimentation and learning how we can use the tools that are out there, right? So if I think about the big learning platforms and Degreed and so on and so forth, there's a lot of good stuff that's being built within those. I think the challenge always is less about, honestly, within this sort of space, I think the forever challenge is like, how do you get people to carve out time for it? That's always the challenge within learning, particularly as I think there's the stuff that people are like being thrown at all day, every day. Is just like amping up all the time. I don't think like just management demands and management practices, but like the mixture of life and work, phone pinging, and now I can have a meeting at any time. And if I've got a gap, I'm going to fill it with 3 meetings and calls and stuff. Like the sort of the toll on individuals of just like the amount of stuff. And I think one of the biggest risks is that the space that people carve out for intentional learning, and intentional learning for what? And I think you're right. I think there are some really good things around career paths, and you think about the number of tools that are out there doing looking at competencies and looking at, okay, like where can I go? What can I learn? And like the tools are there, but it doesn't detract from actually the problem is like anybody having any time to do it. And so I think as much as like we think about how we can unlock sort of career pathing and so on through the technology and AI, actually, I think it's our bigger problem is like, how do we get people to carve out any time to do it in the first place? Yeah.
So I think that's interesting. And again, I'm like this deep. I'm like over my head in this research right now of AI and how it's affecting the learning technology that's out there. But one of the things that I find that is particularly interesting is that a lot of the functionalities that we've seen as separate standalone things are now being combined. For example, assessment is now being combined with coaching. And so it's not necessarily like a separate thing that you do. It's assessing me as I go along and it's adjusting and coaching me so that I can do my job better in the flow of that work. You know what I mean? Are you all thinking about that at all? Or
I think thinking about it, and I think it's the other piece around that is what is the experience? What's the employee experience? And how do you tie these things together, right? There's so many sort of opportunities, but it's still around the questions of, is it in the flow of work? How do we, again, it comes more to an access and the experience thing than it does the possibility of the tools in many ways. And I think the possibility of the tools are endless and we're continuing to explore that. To your point around like, how do you connect these things together when people are thinking about like performance and potential and thinking about career growth and skills and the opportunities for experiences and for projects and all of this sort of stuff. In the way that we sometimes, I think, come out with this stuff is very segmented, go here for this, and so on and so forth. But the way that people want to experience it is like in one place. And I think that is a challenge that we're thinking about it with orchestration layers and experiences and all that, this piece around it is like, how do you actually make it meaning for people, not as distinct technologies as a consistent experience?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the sort of the rules on experience have changed in the last 2 years for sure, probably even a little bit more recently, because the very best experience you can have now is like a GPT microphone. That's the best experience you can have and get you all the information you need. And so if we're asking people to go different places or have different experiences, don't necessarily like...
I think it's really interesting for the people tech sector, right? I think UI, UX, like we've all talked about like forever. And it is like everybody, I think there's been a lot of optimizing over the last few years for that. But now to your point is like actually the user experience is going to be as basic as like voice and response. It's not like how cool is this and how is it and how few clicks do I take to get here? And like, it's a really interesting sort of piece. So like, where's the maximal value going to be derived from the technology if ultimately... You're right. The way you access it ultimately should be like, I ask a question, I get an answer. Like it's conversational. So it's a really interesting one.
Seems like all the experience is shifting to the back instead of residing in the front now. Yeah.
And I think this goes into this whole single pane of glass discussion. Is there just a single interface, like whether it's a GPT or something like that? And I know you all are early Copilot adopters, if I'm correct. And so are you thinking about Copilot as that single pane of glass for the employee experience, or is that a vision for the future?
Yeah, I think we're exploring a whole bunch of different options, right? I think there are various organizations, and I think about sort of IBM and Watson. I think about obviously Microsoft and that side of things and Teams and Copilot. And I think we're looking at like, we are actively thinking about what is the best experience layer going to be? What's the best orchestration layer and the single pane of glass and all of that sort of stuff? And how are we balancing that with, okay, like the back-end technology is the back-end technology system of records and workflows, or like the workflows matter when you've got data lakes and everything that which the orchestration layer is different. So I think it's just a really interesting ongoing one that's moving very fast. We're very lucky. We've got a phenomenal sort of technology organization, and our people systems and people strategy team are thinking about this all the time. But it's a really interesting dynamic conversation really at the moment.
And I think we're going to see some major shifts from the vendors as well as they start to think about this too. Jeremy, we literally could talk to you about this forever. I think there are so many questions we did not get to, but this was incredibly rich. So thank you. And I'm going to ask one follow-up question, and Danny has one as well. And mine is, if our listeners could take away one thing from your experience, what would you want that to be?
I think that there is no right answer. So like the right answer today is going to be the wrong answer tomorrow. And I think that's what we've learned is that, again, I go back to like, it's more important to keep asking the questions than it is to try and land an answer, because I think that's the most important thing we've learned through it, or I've learned through it.
Thank you.
Final question. We ask this question to everybody that's on our podcast. Why do you do the work that you do?
I think it's just phenomenally interesting work. I think what gets me out of bed is the conversations, and it's just a really interesting time. I think the role that people play in where industry's going, where work's going, I think it's getting actually more important as all of this, the technologies advance rather than less important, the distinct impact that one individual can have when they have humanity's knowledge at their fingertips and computing power at their fingertips, it increases rather than diminishes, I think, the opportunity. So I'm just really excited where it's going. And I think the fact that we're learning new stuff every day is hugely exciting.
Thanks for being with us, Jeremy.
That's the optimist again. Sorry. I've got to bring a healthy dose of pessimism next time.
I'm waiting for someone to come in and be like, the paycheck. Why do you think I do this?
Thank you, Jeremy.
Great. I really appreciate it. Thanks very much for the time.
Okay, that's a wrap for this episode of Workplace Stories. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to our podcast so that you can be the first to know about future episodes. For exclusive access to our research, insights, and a vibrant network of human capital leaders, consider joining the Red Thread Research community. Visit redthreadresearch.com to learn more and to take your workplace to the next level.